NATO defense ministers meet while Russia reiterates demands that Ukraine stays out of NATO. The military alliance says it's yet to believe that Russia's unprecedented troop buildup is backing down, but is the West taking any of Moscow's concerns into consideration? I'm Andrea Sankey, and today's newsmaker is Russia's NATO problem. Well, it's the day the U.S. said Russia could invade Ukraine. That didn't happen. Instead, many Ukrainians have been marking the day with displays of patriotism. President Volodymyr Zelensky declared this February 16th a day of unity with the stated aim of strengthening society and the nation's resilience in the face of threats which everyone hoped were evaporating. Ukraine's foreign ministry was quick to claim victory on Tuesday after Russia announced it was pulling some troops back from the border. But Moscow says it was always planning to bring those forces back to their permanent bases after their military exercises were complete. And both NATO and U.S. President Joe Biden say they haven't yet verified Russia's claims and that an invasion remains a possibility.
If Russia does invade in the days and weeks ahead, the human cost for Ukraine will be immense. And the strategic cost for Russia will also be immense. If Russia attacks Ukraine, it'll be met with overwhelming international condemnation. The world will not forget that Russia chose needless death and destruction. Invading Ukraine will prove to be a self-inflicted wound. The United States and our allies and partners will respond decisively. The West is united and galvanized. Today, our NATO allies and the alliance is as unified and determined as it has ever been. And the source of our unbreakable strength continues to be the power, resilience, and universal appeal of our shared democratic values.
Now, Russia has consistently denied that it wants conflict. It says that scenario would be lose-lose. In fact, it's been upfront from the beginning that what it really wants is a public promise that the former Soviet Republic of Ukraine not be allowed to join NATO, and that NATO forces be pulled back from much of Eastern Europe, or more specifically, from any country that joined the alliance after 1997. Western powers have repeatedly said that's not going to happen. And while the U.S. formally replied to Russia's security demands, Putin says its key concerns have been ignored.
We see the forceful constraint of Russia as a direct threat to our national security, and legal obligations based on our drafts are meant to ease that threat. I repeat, the answers for our security guarantee proposals given to us by the United States and NATO do not address Russia's fundamental demands. Do we want war or not? Of course not. That's why we have offered our proposals to start the negotiation process, which should lead to an agreement of providing equal security for everyone, including our country.
But NATO's obligations to provide equal security only extend to its members. And it's a club that's grown massively since forming in 1949, largely to deter Soviet expansion. Back then, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization was made up of just 12 countries. Today, there are 30 nations, and its membership has more than doubled in just the past 25 years. NATO defense ministers are meeting at headquarters in Brussels to address what it calls the most serious security crisis Europe has faced in decades. And Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg says he's seen no evidence that Russia is de-escalating the situation on the ground.
We are, of course, monitoring very closely what Russia does in and around Ukraine. What we see is that they have increased the number of troops and more troops are on their way. So far, no de-escalation, but of course we hear also the messages about diplomacy, and we are ready to engage in diplomatic efforts with Russia.
Well, if it's all sounding a bit familiar and repetitive, well, that's exactly how it's sounding to the Russians, too. The Kremlin says It's sick of threats being repeated against us like a mantra. So joining me now to discuss that position and more are from Moscow, Viacheslav Matuzov. He's a former Russian diplomat and political analyst. From Washington, we have Mark Kimmitt, a former U.S. Assistant Secretary of State for Political and Military Affairs. And from Uppsala, Sweden, is Greg Simons. He's an associate professor at the Institute for Russian and Eurasian Studies at Uppsala University. Thanks all so much for being with us. So on the day, or I guess I should say one of the days, we heard there would be a Russian invasion of Ukraine. We're really seeing nothing of the sort. So like it or not, Mark Kimmitt, I'll start with you. It does feed into that Russian narrative that the U.S. and NATO are deliberately causing, they're calling it hysteria, and misrepresenting facts on the ground to make Russia the villain and justify, any potential NATO action. So is there any truth to that, do you think? And is there a danger in that of, a boy who cried wolf scenario?
Well, I think you've got to look at the 125,000 well-trained military forces sitting on the border, not training, not exercising, not based in that area, and ask if there is not a threat, then what are they doing there? I think you've also got to ask why the Russian EU ambassador said, if you have any problems with our separatists inside the Donbass, we will attack and we will defend them. You've got to ask, what is the intentions of the Russians with all of their rhetoric that says Ukraine must not join NATO? So we are simply responding to the Russian provocation and the Russian threats and intimidation of Ukraine.
Okay, I'll tell you what. We actually had an exclusive interview with Alexei Arkov. He is the Russian ambassador to Turkey. He spoke on precisely this issue. I want to listen quickly to what he said. And Vyacheslav, I want you to comment on it. Let's listen in.
There is literally a kind of hysteria around this issue, and I'm not exaggerating. Citizens are being evacuated, embassies are being closed and relocated. There's talk of an almost inevitable Russian invasion of Ukraine, and even its possible dates are being articulated. By the way, one such date was yesterday, the other is today, the third one will be tomorrow. And so what, has the invasion taken place? And at the same time, the most modern weapons, including strike weapons, are being pumped into Ukraine, and foreign instructors are sent to the Ukrainian army. The main thing is that the preconditions for provocative actions are being created, tensions are being pumped up. In general, one gets an impression that on the sly, someone would obviously not mind provoking us to some reckless actions in order to then use the so-called hellish sanctions against Russia.
It's interesting when I hone in on the middle part of what we just heard there, because Mark Kimmitt, it runs almost parallel to what you were saying about the U.S. sentiment. And he's saying that at the same time, the most modern weapons, including strike weapons, are being pumped into Ukraine, foreign instructors sent to train the Ukrainian army. So it's really remarkable to see Russia almost complain about the same dynamics from the other side. Vyacheslav, let me turn to you, though, because Russia has said that it has drawn back troops, and NATO right now is saying that there's no proof of that. So what is the issue there? Is it Russian propaganda, or are they manipulating something here to try to make it look like they're being less of an aggressor that the U.S. and NATO see them as?
It is propaganda, but not Russian. Russia proved on all levels, level of Putin, level of Lavrov, of our embassy in Turkey, any other country, even in our embassy in the United States. They proved that there's no preparation for any war against Ukraine, that there is no threat for independence of Ukrainian state, because all our maneuver, all our military exercises nearby the borders with Ukraine, it is on Russian territory. And I can say that from time to time, maybe once a year, such kind of exercises were met. This time, exercises on great scale, that's surely, because some of people came from even Far East, from Marines. Russian Marines were brought to Belarus and participating with Belarusian our army in maneuvering in cost of the Ukraine. There is. But we proclaim that this maneuvering, this exercise is not against Ukraine.
Okay.
It's absolutely.
It really is.
There, one thing that we should be, remember, that if Ukraine, under pressure of NATO, push their troops to Donbass and will be bloodshed there, Russia can be stayed aside. That's sure.
Okay, Greg, let me turn to you because, I mean, these perspectives could not be more extreme. And you complained before, actually, about the problem being a facade of diplomacy, whereby parties were talking but not actually listening to each other. I mean, to what extent is that still the case today? And do you think one side is arguably more guilty than the other of not listening?
Well, absolutely. This has not begun this November. The origins have begun much earlier. I mean, if we look back to 1989, the guarantees for NATO not to expand eastward, this was Jack Matlock, the former ambassador to the US ambassador to USSR, was there, and he verified this. In 1997, you had a letter to Bill Clinton who said NATO should not expand. It will create problems with Russia in the future. So, I mean, this is a problem which is not recent. One can also see that if you have the Ukrainian defense minister saying there is no indication that Russia is going to invade, they do not have the sufficient troops, the right troops, equipment to successfully do that. Even Zelensky has backed off and said, he actually demanded proof from the US for a Russian invasion. This has been a crying wolf, and it's got much more emotional. And unfortunately, when things get emotional, people tend to talk over the top of each other, and this increases the risk of inadvertent, otherwise, action that could lead to a bigger disaster.
Let me turn to Mark Kimmitt then. I mean, Mark, can you go back a little bit? Not a little bit, it is quite a few decades, but explain why NATO then originally diverted from the pledges it had made about non-expansion, that logically Russia sees as a threat to its own security now.
Yeah, but first of all, I need to respond to Mr. Matuzov's point. He spent about 5 minutes talking about how Russia was not going to invade. Yet at the last part of his discussion, he said, yet if Ukraine puts forces in the Donbass, there will be serious consequences. If we recognize Ukraine as a sovereign nation, why shouldn't it make sovereign decisions to place its military forces wherever without the outside influence or the outside threats of a foreign country, which is exactly what Russia has just said they will do? Now, I was in NATO in 1999, working there for the Supreme Allied Commander. There were some considerations. We had the NATO Ukraine Council, and there was, at that time, a decision taken by NATO to not expand eastward into Ukraine. But once Ukraine became fully independent, fully sovereign, they made their own decisions. NATO is not forcing Ukraine to join NATO. Ukraine is asking to join NATO because of the continued pressure that they are seeing from Russia and the expansionist moves of Russia into places such as Crimea and parts of Moldova. Ukraine has a legitimate fear, and those fears are expressed by people such as my friend, Mr. Matuzov. And so naturally, they want to look west instead of east, and they're considering joining a defensive security arrangement that can prevent organizations, such countries such as Russia, from intimidating them. So it makes all the sense in the world to me.
I'll let Vyacheslav respond. Go ahead.
Yes. You see, there is a principal contradictions between Russia and the United States, understanding what is going on in eastern Ukraine. What is the reason? The reason is one. America considered is war between Russia and Ukraine. Russia don't look at this conflict as an international conflict between two countries. On the contrary, we see that Donbass, Donetsk and Lugansk area, it is Ukrainian territory, and we considered, we didn't acknowledge the independence of Lugansk and Donetsk Republic. They proclaimed their independence. We didn't till now accepted this new creation of two republics. And we're pushing them to the one state reality with Ukraine. We consider, and not only we, and all other European countries, France and Germany, as a co-sponsors of peaceful solution of political solution of Ukrainian crisis, with Russia as sponsors for Minsk project. Minsk agreement is a principle approved by the United States Security Council.
Okay.
What you need, Russia is the side of this struggle.
I do want to talk about the Minsk agreement in just a second. Mark, if you had a quick comment, I saw your hand go up. Go ahead, but I need to get to Greg quickly if you can.
Yes, if Mr. Matuzov is correct that Russia recognizes the sovereignty of Ukraine over the Donbass, Luhansk, and Donetsk, then why did the Duma yesterday vote to bring those two regions into the Russian Federation? And everyone knows that the Duma is simply a puppet for Putin. So if they have no aspirations on that region, then why is the Duma asking Putin to absorb those regions into Russia?
Okay, that's exactly what I wanted to talk to Greg about. Go ahead, Vyacheslav.
I have the answer because, this was made under discussion in our Duma. It was yesterday voting. That's right. There were two sub-offers, two projects for this decision. First was for giving the foreign ministry to study the details of opportunity, or don't have opportunity to push this idea to the president to sign it. But other project was made by one of the leftist faction in our parliament, considered it is voting for acknowledging independence of two republics and pushing to president directly to sign it and to be a part of Russian policy. Till now, this question is suspended by the signing of Putin. If Putin signed, I am not sure, by the way. I am sure that Putin will not cite this decision of parliament.
Okay.
And without it signing, it will not working. But it's a signal to the United States. If they will try to push Ukrainian army to bloodshed in Donbass, Russia immediately accept the offer of our parliament and acknowledge Donetsk, Lugansk as an independent republic, and we will face same situation that we faced in South Ossetia was 08.
Right. We're hearing a lot of parallels with the issues of the separatist regions in Georgia. But let me first go to Greg and ask, one, Vyacheslav doesn't think Putin will actually sign off on this resolution to recognize the independence of Donetsk and Luhansk. I want to know if you agree with that. And at any rate, what kind of spanner does it throw into the works here and changes the dynamics of what's actually happening? Because some are saying now that, it means the death of the Minsk Accords if it is recognized. But some say, well, the Minsk Accords aren't worth much anyway because Russia and Ukraine cannot agree on what they actually say.
Well, I'll just begin with a response and then get into these questions. First of all, I think it's rather problematic to assume that Ukraine is a sovereign country. It has not been sovereign since at least 2014. And this is clearly so when you can see, for example, Biden was able to remove the prosecutor general from his office because he is investigating Hunter Biden. This is just one little window. You can also see Zelensky is getting cold feet. He doesn't like being an object of these events. He is wanting to gain some kind of active say in this because it's getting dangerous. But yes, that would be the nuclear option if this was ratified. I mean, this would be shutting things down, but this would be dependent on the actions of the US-led actions. And this, it would shut, it would create, as you say, these parallels, what happened in the end of 2008.
Okay.
But, yeah.
Greg, let me just ask you this. I mean, going back to the broader kind of global perceptions of this conflict, I mean, how big is the divide really between perceptions in the West versus the East, including what we see in the media? I mean, how much do you think the West maybe underestimates? Some argue how threatened Russia really feels in all of this, that they feel provoked oftentimes by the West and by NATO expansion, and that, you know, Russia keeps characterizing this all as a hysteria that's been created. I mean, again, this divide in perception between what is really happening and who's provoking whom. Have we ever seen anything like this?
Well, we had, of course, the US attempts to cultivate conditions for the 2003 invasion of Iraq. So you had concentrated propaganda there. So this is not the first time that propaganda has been used to manipulate conflict and reduce the operational choices for their opponent. But yes, this is distinctly manipulative. I mean, even Zelensky is telling the West to tone it down because it's getting too dangerous. The Ukrainian defense minister has done the same. And I mean, this is not specifically about Ukraine, but bigger issues tied where Ukraine is the vehicle to realize these geopolitical and geoeconomic goals, which, so for instance, to not allow Germany a more freer and closer relationship with Russia, to interdict the Nord Stream 2 pipeline. These are all strategic imperatives of the US.
Okay. We're down to our final minutes. I do want to give at least a couple minutes to both our other panelists for final thoughts. Mark Kimmitt, go ahead.
Well, first of all, I think Greg was a little bit misplaced when he suggested invoking the nuclear option in front of a Russian and American. Well, look, it is very clear that Mr. Matuzov is one of the most brilliant analysts I've ever crossed swords with in these discussions. But even he must understand how weak his argument is. NATO is a defensive arrangement. We are certainly not expecting to go into Ukraine as part of an offensive operation. Ukraine is simply trying to defend itself. We are trying to assist as a NATO alliance. And the weapons that we're pushing into Ukraine right now are purely for defensive purposes. Anybody that believes that Ukraine is threatening the territorial sovereignty or the defense of Russia, I think, has seriously misunderstood the situation.
Okay.
Well, let's hope that diplomacy works out, and let's hope that this comes to a reconciliation. I hope we can see the Russian troops move off the border back into their barracks.
Okay.
And the whole issues within Ukraine can be solved by the Ukrainians themselves.
Okay. Viacheslav Matuzov, go ahead. Your final thoughts.
Well, NATO is not defensive organization. I am sorry, Mr. Kimmitt, because I remind you Yugoslavia, I remind you Afghanistan participation, American and NATO forces in Afghanistan. And then as an Arabist, I can remind you about Libya, role of NATO in Libya dissolving, in destroying this whole state. So I can say that all policy of NATO in Eastern Europe, in Poland, in Romania, and Bulgaria, for example, last decade shows that they're pushing anti-rocket systems. And our specialist military consider that all those installations possibly can use for Tomahawk rockets. They are not defensive. They are not against, but they are for, and covering Russian territory till the Ural Mountains. So I can say that not nature of NATO organization is important for us. We are having relations with NATO as it is, because NATO is different. But I think that main response, we believe that Ukraine is not the place for NATO 24 years, as Mr. Biden, President Biden said. No place for Ukraine in NATO.
Vyacheslav Matuzov, I'm going to have to interrupt you there. We are completely, in fact, over time for this edition of The Newsmakers. I'm going to have to give you the final word, and I'd like to thank really all three of my panelists so much for being with us. Really a fascinating discussion. And our viewers, of course, for tuning in as well. Remember to follow us on Twitter at @the_newsmakers. And be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel. I'm Andrea Sankey. We'll see you next time.